Okay. Hi, and welcome to the webinar, Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing and a Campus Culture War. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Kochs off campus. We began our work against Koch donor influence at the University of Arizona. It was embodied at that time by the Freedom Center. Because that center receives money from the state legislature, we tried to get Koch donor influence out of the state legislature. We're still working on that, as you can imagine. And because we realized that there was a high school course here in Tucson that offered dual credit to seniors and was organized by that same Freedom Center, we did a deep dive into the textbook, which was written and published by who? The Freedom Center, of course. By exposing the really poorly written and researched textbook and the clearly biased curriculum, we were able to get the course canceled from both TUSD and the Amphi School District. That course, however, which is funded by, or was funded by a grant from the Templeton Foundation, was in many other schools, and some of them are even in Mexico. And the textbook has been rewritten, so our work continues on that front. So whether you're interested in the Koch donor influence at the state level, or in our universities, or in our public schools, Kochs off campus could really use your energy. We're always looking for volunteers. You have our website, you may be on our mailing list. Step up and help us in this work. As you dig in, you'll find out that Koch influence is everywhere. But guess what? So are we. And you could join us, and we'd love it if you would. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the authors. You've probably heard these blurbs somewhere, so I'm going to run through them quickly. Ralph Wilson is the founder of Corporate Genome Project. Previously, he was co-founder and research director of UnKoch My Campus, a national organization. There, he helped students and faculty resist corporate donor influence on college campuses. Isaac Kamola is an associate professor of political science at Trinity College. He was the co-editor of the Transnational Politics of Higher Education, Contesting the Global, Transforming the Local, and the author of Making the World Global, US Universities and the Production of the Global Imaginary, which was released in 2019. A little bit about the book, Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War. I was able to read a promo copy, and I'm here to tell you that it is an excellent book. It is meticulously researched and extraordinarily readable. Whether you know about the topic or you're new to the topic, it is a fascinating book. I will let the authors tell you the details, but I just want you to know that it's a great book that bridges the gaps between theory, education, and what the beep can I do about everything that I just learned. And so with that, I would like to move on to introducing the authors. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thanks, Bets. I'm going to go ahead and share screen, if that's okay. Well, actually, let me just introduce myself. I'm Ralph Wilson, and Isaac here is my co-author. And maybe we can just kind of jump into a discussion of what we've done in the book, and then we can take all sorts of questions. Can everyone see that shared screen? Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having us, and appreciate the introduction. This book coming out in November is a labor of love between Isaac and I. That's really an attempt to give a more meaningful look at what a lot of people are familiar with as a recent campus free speech crisis or cancel culture crisis. It's kind of a political caricature that has been used in a lot of ways that people are somewhat familiar with, and in a lot of ways that people don't see very easily. So what we try to do in the book is expose the larger pieces of and motivations behind this, what is actually a manufactured crisis. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the donors that are driving the thing, as has been mentioned, the Kochs, Templetons, and others, and then a little bit about the work that we've done in the book. So if I can just kind of jump right into it, Charles Koch sits at the head of Koch Industries and is one of many corporate ideologues that is trying to drive public policy in the US and elsewhere. And essentially in chapter 1, what we do is we look at that current political network and its roots decades back in their efforts to oppose civil rights and to combat labor and regulations and taxation, et cetera. Not just to kind of connect them to their opposition to the civil rights movement as we see it now, but also to look at the history of using free speech as a political weapon. And so we kind of examine the beginnings of that, which go all the way back to tobacco industry political efforts. But we kind of, in chapter 1, trace this donor network and the evolution of their strategies, including their use of free speech. But one of the most important things, and the kind of a lens that we see the book through, is a particular strategy developed and deployed by the Charles Koch Foundation and their large network of donors. And that is a strategy that they call the structure of social change, and it's embodied by this figure here. And so essentially what you had was, for decades, donors donating money to universities, to think tanks, to politicians, and none of it ever being quite as effective as they desired. And so what they eventually realized was that they had to themselves integrate their philanthropy. And so what you see here is several levels of philanthropy that these donors essentially target. So funding, for example, these different entities in order to manufacture as sort of an industrial process of manufacturing political change. And so, for example, they see funding academia and universities as producing raw materials. So seeing this as an industrial process where raw materials, raw ideas, political ideas are developed through universities and then fed into think tanks, which refine these ideas and boil them down into more usable policy ideas, reports, et cetera. And then those policy ideas are handed off to other kinds of political groups that essentially push the advocacy of these ideas through political networks and through public pressure and the appearance of mass support. And then the final step of this is decision makers that are targeted with funding, who then pass these ideas into law. And so from idea all the way into policy implementation, this strategy utilizes a targeted and very careful philanthropic process to create policy change that favors corporate donors. And so in the book, we sort of take them at their word and we say, okay, if this is your model for social change, let's see how you used it. So this is a figure that we've developed for the book that kind of outlines the pieces of their political machine as we understand them and also as they understand them. And so throughout the chapters, we'll explain further essentially what it is people think of as the campus free speech crisis, that is in fact a much larger politically orchestrated attempt to transform higher education in favor of these corporate donors. And so we kind of examine several pieces of that, each chapter being a different piece. And so Isaac, maybe you can take over and talk about chapter 2, as it were.
Great. So our first chapter, am I showing up there? Can people see me? Or they?
I guess I see the slide probably.
Oh, they see the slide. Great. So basically, our first chapter looks at the donor strategy that Ralph just outlined, and then we kind of break that up and look at the different the different integrated components that make up the broader Koch-funded effort to capture and gain access to higher education. And one of the ways that Koch Network has been incredibly successful is funding a number of student groups, right? And in the same way that their structure of social change is imagined as modeled on a capitalist economy, the Koch network has funded a number of student groups, not just one, not just two, but 3, 4, 5 groups that are all kind of doing a similar thing, which is identifying students on college campuses, recruiting them, grooming them, training them into the freedom movement is what they call it, and then integrating those students that graduated into the broader structure of social change. This is what they shamelessly call a talent pipeline, right? To identify students, groom them, train them, give them skills, and then place them in think tanks and in elected officials' offices and in the media and elsewhere. So the chapter, the book that we wrote as a field guide, which basically means that you could read a chapter on student groups, and there's short sections on a number of different student groups, allowing you to kind of quickly get an overview of what these groups do and how they operate. And so I think that the student group chapter does a nice job of demonstrating kind of the various ways that the Koch donor network has infiltrated campuses through a number of different institutions. So Students for Liberty is a student group that was founded in 2008 by fellows who were at the Kochs summer program. It has a special flavor where their focus is on international. So they have student groups that are set up in Latin America and Europe and Africa and Asia, all around the world. A lot of those student groups were heavily involved in, for example, the coup against Lula in Brazil, work against other governments, especially socialist governments in Latin America, but also is strong on U.S. Campuses. It's an associate member of the State Policy Network, which means it's already deeply enmeshed within the broader Koch apparatus, and from our counting of the 990 tax documents gets $3.4 million from Bradley Koch, Donor Trust, Donor Capital Fund, plus a whole bunch of which are the 3 main groups that we document. In our appendix in the back of the book, we kind of Ralph pulled the 90s and kind of tabulated the total amounts of money from these 4 groups. But then we demonstrate that there's a lot of other money coming from other locations. Young Americans for Liberty is another student group. This one was the kind of after the Students for Ron Paul, the Ron Paul campaign kind of turned into a student group. And this is really tied in with the paleo libertarian movement, which we talk about, which has, again, is slightly different from the Students for Liberty, big into Ron Paul, big into kind of paleo libertarianism. Their big thing that they're known for is they hand out constitutions outside of free speech zones on campuses with the intent of then being punished, and then use that to bring lawsuits against universities. They also, it's quite ridiculous, but they have a large free speech ball that's one of their events where they push around this large free speech ball and encourage students to write whatever they want on it, and again to kind of play up this idea of being crusaders for free speech. Young Americans for Freedom is interesting because this we talk about as kind of like the old guard conservative movement, and the student group, a group that is kind of tied in with the old school Republican party and the Buckley wing of the right. And it's interesting because whereas y'all and Students for Liberty are kind of newer groups, YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, is an older group that has basically over years increasingly been co-opted. It kind of is a legacy brand we talk about in the book that the Kochs and the Koch donor network has kind of taken this more morbid brand and kind of recapitalized it in order to kind of capture on its cachet and to have yet another student group in the on-campus space. And they've been known for some of the most vile actions on campus, like the affirmative action bake sales they popularized, Catch an Illegal Immigrant Day. And they've also been, as was released by chat logs, have trained a number of the leading white supremacists and neo-Nazis of that college. A number of them were trained in Young Americans for Freedom. Do you want to hit the slide, Ralph? Great. And then the newest one, probably everybody's heard of, a Turning Points USA. This is kind of like the Trumpiest new right student group that is funded by just a number of the big names in the Koch right, and they do the professor watch list, and they're really kind of in big time in the culture wars, and do a lot of work. Kind of investing in student government races is one thing that they do. They also ran Trump's campus GOTV operation, and there's been a number of lawsuits against them because they were illegally providing campaign support to the Trump campaign. And they are kind of some of the most unabashed kind of culture warrior student groups. And then so we talk about the student groups. So these student groups are on campus, and then what a lot of these student groups, they have tons of money provided by their national to invite students to campus, or to invite controversial speakers to campus. So we look at three speakers in particular: Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, and Charles Murray. And we basically look at how their entire careers are basically funded by plutocratic libertarians within the Koch donor network. Milo Yiannopoulos, of course, being funded by the Mercer family. And Charles Murray, I think, is really interesting in that his whole career is funded as part of the Manhattan Institute and later the American Enterprise Institute, and basically a person of little academic merit, but he gets invited to campus at Middlebury, for example, because there is a student group, a Young American, American Enterprise Institute student group that gets funded by the American Enterprise Institute to bring Charles Murray, who's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, to campus, right? And so you have this kind of outside groups that are able to bring in controversial speakers. Those controversial speakers are basically people whose entire careers, the only reason why they're people of merit, or that would be names that any of us would recognize, is because they've been platformed by the same plutocratic libertarians that are funding the student groups that then invite those speakers to campus. So I won't go into too much detail. I spent entirely too long reading Milo Yiannopoulos and Charles Murray for this book. I want those weeks back. I want those brain cells back. And then we also, our next chapter looks at the right-wing media ecosystem. And here we demonstrate that there's a number of organizations, especially Campus Reform and College Fix, that specialize in basically surveilling colleges and universities, where they're quote unquote newsrooms that specialize in writing outrage pieces. They hire students for between $50 and $100 per story to write stories that go something like this. Oh my God, can you believe Professor X at School Y said this outrageous thing? Isn't that crazy? And then that story is then fed directly into the right-wing media ecosystem, which itself is funded by many of the same donors. Breitbart is funded by the Mercers, of course, and there's a number of these. The right-wing media ecosystem is even funded by foundations that then take money from non-profits to the nonprofit side, that then produces stories and publishes them on their for-profit website. And basically what Campus Reform and the College Fix and other outlets like this is, they pump that right-wing media ecosystem full of outrage stories about higher education. In the case of Campus Reform, for example, they have a direct pipeline with Fox News. They train a lot of journalists and then place them in places like Fox News. And then when Fox News needs a story about something outrageous that is happening on some college campus somewhere, they turn to Campus Reform and kind of collaborate. And Campus Reform basically becomes a a reserve of people who are willing to talk about the outrageous things that are supposedly happening on college campuses. So it creates this fully funded, plutocratic, libertarian funded media ecosystem that then has all of these on-ramps that are media outlets that are specializing in kind of campus outrage. So back to you, Ralph.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of show back now that you've talked through, how these student groups apply pressure on campus and they bring provocateurs, and then those crises are fodder for these media outlets that Isaac was just describing. And that, I think, is one of the more well-known parts of what's understood as the campus free speech crisis, at least in terms of provocative speakers and protests going on. But the remaining chapters of the book, we really looked at some of the lesser known parts that feed off of this phenomena, but have less understood, less well-known outcomes. So for example, in chapter 5, we talk about not just the outrage that's generated from these student groups that invite the provocative speakers and feed them into this media ecosystem, but they also provide the basis for a tremendous amount of litigation. And so there's an ecosystem of litigation groups, basically a network of groups within the Koch network, funded by these same donors that fund the student groups, that fund the provocateurs, that fund the media outlets, and they take these a large number of events that are being generated on campus and use them to sue the universities. In large part, what they're doing is suing, for example, someone not being allowed on campus, or some controversial speaker's talk being moved somewhere else on campus, or being asked to pay security fees or something to this effect, and basically trying to make it use legal weaponry to shoehorn these far-right speakers onto campus, but also to strip away campus free speech policies. So every campus has its own essentially developed policies about free speech, about who's allowed on campus, et cetera. Universities historically regulate themselves, and they develop these policies much like the other academic policies that guide campus life. But what this litigation starts to do is pick away at those policies as written by universities and conform them to the hyper free market, hyper free speech, fundamentalist views of the far right and the Koch donor network. So FIRE has been around the longest in terms of doing a lot of this free speech campus work. Speech First is a newer organization that uses lawsuits to go after certain programs on campus where people can report racist incidents, and they call this like thought police. Alliance Defending Freedom has a larger niche in the far Christian right. They're actually Southern Poverty Law Center has them designated as a hate group. They're very much anti-LGBTQ litigation group, funding for religious freedom. They're suing for religious freedom purposes, but they also do a lot of work. And a lot of these groups, when they fund, or when they sue a university, they're suing on behalf of those student groups as well, very often. And so you have multiple Koch network entities, student groups and their litigation groups, caught up in this litigation, just very much feeding off of each other. And so this is one way in which, as we see, these litigation groups apply further pressure, in this case, legal pressure, onto campus policymakers. But if that weren't enough, what we've seen, and kind of what was the impetus of this book in terms of this line of research, was that there was a larger policy agenda that was being carried out, and that the campus free speech false crisis was being used as basically the reasoning behind why all of these policies need to be passed. So sort of characteristic of this network, there's multiple little networks working together to achieve highly specific, very specialized goals. And so in 2016, 2017, aside from all of the controversial speakers on campus and protests and media and lawsuits, there began a flurry of bills that were filed all across the country. These campus free speech bills originated largely from think tanks and advocacy groups within the Koch network. So for example, one of the most prevalent ones was developed by the Goldwater Institute, which is a Koch network think tank in Arizona. So essentially what we saw was a lot of these bills flying around based on model legislation that was developed by Goldwater. Another model bill was developed by American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. And sometimes these were even sort of introduced to the public as dueling bills, the pros and cons being given from one to the other, when in fact they were coming from the same places. And so the one figure from the book, we compare really the effects of this legislation, model legislation developed by FIRE, by the Goldwater Institute, and by American Legislative Exchange Council, and show that really they have a tremendous amount of overlapping effects when it comes to either eroding the public forum doctrine on campus, which is what determines essentially, who can speak where, whether it be punishing protest, which all of them do in some way, whether it is forced re-education on campuses, whether or not the university can be held accountable for certain things now or sued. And a lot of these really, a lot of the most awful components of these bills allow someone to sue another student or the university if they feel their free speech has been abridged in some way. And so essentially you have now another legal punitive measure that can prevent protesters, that can act as a shoehorn to ensure that these far-right speakers are coming to campus. And in a nod to the far Christian right who is working with them, there's one of the bills also allows student groups to discriminate, which is just a hidden gem in some of these really awful little bills that are just flying around the country. The other part of this structure of social change involves not just producing policy and getting it in the hands of legislators, which is done through groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, but also pressuring and producing the appearance of public support, which we also examine, done through AstroTurf groups like Americans for Prosperity, and so on. And so Chapter 6 very much examines this line of pressure of policy groups, AstroTurf groups, and lawmakers that are enacting policy change on the state level, forcing universities to align their policies then to these Koch network policies. And so then the last chapter, as if there somehow could be more components to this, we look at the academic centers on campuses that are being funded by the Koch network. As was mentioned early on, one key example were the Freedom Centers at Arizona State University and the University of Arizona. And in Chapter 7, we kind of we profile several different universities and the parts that they've played in this large integrated network, and groups that they've used to coordinate through, like the Institute for Humane Studies and the Atlas Network. But in particular, when we looked at Arizona, we saw just a really clean-cut example of these so-called academic centers working perfectly in tandem with this large political machinery. So for example, there was campus free speech legislation filed and passed in the state of Arizona. And both before and afterward, we see the Koch centers on campuses at ASU and University of Arizona working hand in hand with this network. So for example, at Arizona State University, there was programming in the lead up to the bill's passages that featured the authors of the bills from the Goldwater Institute, that featured the state's governor, Doug Ducey, who is a frequent attendee of the summits put on by Charles Koch and his network of donors. And so you just had no effort to hide the impropriety. This was the Koch network working with all of its pieces that it's funding, trying to push a policy agenda. After the passage of that bill in Arizona, we had the head of the University of Arizona's Freedom Center, David Schmitz, join the committee that was formed to align all of the policies in the state universities. And he joined up and had a hand in that precisely. And so essentially what they ended up was not just having sanctions for people who were alleged to have abridged somebody's free speech or interfered with their speech, but there were also a number of First Amendment monitors that were deployed onto campuses, and students had to take a pledge at the university in accordance with their programming. So that, in a nutshell, are the pieces that the book covers, and really the reasoning behind it was that the large political machinery that we see at play is really there's too much for a single person to be expected to pick up on this, and for your average person to pick up on this, for a student, for an administrator to pick up on this and to understand what's happening without all of this background and context. And so what we wanted to try to do was to unmask this false controversy, this false crisis as manufactured, and also just show all of the relevant moving pieces. And Isaac, I don't know if you want to add anything, but that about sums it up, at least for this part of the discussion of the chapters.
That sounds great. Let's go to Q&A and see what questions there are. There's plenty to talk about.
Okay, we did ask for people to put their questions in the chat, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to take pride of place and start out with mine. I'm sorry. Can you outline for us the difference between, or tension between academic freedom and freedom of speech on the university campus?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Isaac, do you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Okay.
So one of the arguments that we make is that one of the arguments that we make is that part of the strategy that's at play here is a conflation of academic freedom with free speech, right? Is that universities, the model of free speech, especially as the plutocratic libertarians imagine it, is that anybody has the right to say anything they want, right? That a university should be like a public park, where you can go into the public park and say whatever you want. In the libertarian notion of a marketplace of ideas, the best ideas will rise to the top, the bad ideas will sift out, and because everybody's equal in this fanciful free market that doesn't actually exist, but they imagine it does, that idea of saying whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, is kind of that model of free speech that they're advocating for. The reason they're advocating, well, and then academic freedom, on the other hand, is the idea that within the academy, there's constantly the censoring of ideas, right? And it's the ideas that no longer meet academic scrutiny, right? Is that if there's a Holocaust denier, that Holocaust denier does not have the right to speak in a history program, right? Because all of the professional standards of what it means for historians to produce knowledge means that Holocaust denial is not something that you even have to take seriously. You can just ignore it as being outside of the realm, being undefendable in the discipline of history, right? And so basically the academic freedom is constantly in the process of engaged in peer review. You have a freedom to say what you want, but within the standards set up by academic discussion and debate and disciplinary standards, of course. The problem with this is that for the plutocratic libertarians is that their ideas of this kind of imagined anarcho-capitalist world without society, without racism, without structural inequality, without structural violence, without a history of slavery, without all of these things that social theorists have been talking about for decades now, and really kind of made part of the academic, what is talked about in the academy, those plutocratic, those ideas preferred by plutocratic libertarians are kind of being, not given much attention in the academy because they don't meet the standards of what a good argument is anymore. And so basically free speech becomes a way of saying, hey, you guys are not treating our ideas fairly, you're ignoring us. We have free speech rights and we should be taken seriously as well, which you'll notice is exactly the same strategy that they've developed with climate denial, right? Where you manufacture the other side, right? Scientists say that climate change is happening. Well, these scientists say climate change isn't happening. Free speech, let them discuss it, right? As opposed to the kind of the academic production of knowledge would be, according to all scientific standards, climate change is happening and is man-made, end of story, right? So that idea, those ideas around climate denial shouldn't have a place in the academy. So this kind of weaponization of free speech is a way to get the academy require and put external pressure on universities to have discussions about platform, engage, have to address these ideas that the plutocratic libertarian donors want the academy to be talking about. But because of the way that academic debate and discussion takes place and the process of peer review takes place, that those ideas don't have a strong place in the academy. So you create kind of a parallel academy, the Institute for Humane Studies, the Mercantis Center, all of these Koch programs where you can kind of create the semblance of a university, but it's producing ideas that the donors want produced, not ideas that are produced by the kind of give and take of the academic process.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat now. So Charles Koch is getting older and older every day. I think he's in his 80s now. Who do we need to keep an eye on once Koch is gone? Who do we need to keep an eye on to continue the Koch network legacy?
You want that one, Ralph?
Sure, yeah. Well, Charles Koch does have a son. His name is Chase Koch. And although they would portray him as slightly less political than his father, he's definitely been staying involved in a lot of what we see as the Koch donor network activities. And so I think, I mean, you have basically all the people who are around Charles Koch who continue his work without bearing his name. But you know, he also does have another generation, which would make it a third generation now of problematic Koch largesse and influence in politics, because as mentioned in the book and in some other works like Jane Mayer's Dark Money, Charles Koch's father was involved in the John Birch Society and has kind of passed these ideas and these activities down to his son. And so we definitely already see that in Charles Koch's son a bit as well. But there's also some big donors. Art Pope is probably one of the biggest and most central donors. He was in North Carolina, but he took over from Charles Koch as the chair of the Institute for Humane Studies. So I think he's definitely one to keep an eye on, even though he's not one of the donors that we've profiled. He is, actually, I think he sits on the board of the Bradley Foundation. So scratch that. He's involved with the Bradley Foundation.
I think too, the concept, we use this concept of the Koch donor network. And on the one hand, we think that it is useful because there definitely is this strategy of social change, the creation of integrated think tanks, academic centers, and advocacy groups that are all working together but appear to be autonomous. Like that's a particular brilliant strategy that's invented kind of and perfected by the Charles Koch and the Koch as seminar group, right? But at the same time, there's a lot that is not necessarily cohesive, right? There's places where the Mercers, for example, go along with the Kochs, and other places where they diverge. And there's certain groups and individuals that have interests in some things and not in others. And so I think that it's helpful to have the concept of the Koch donor network and to personify it in Charles Koch, but also that this is a broader network, and that there's other people that are involved. And I think that the really tricky part is that it's a strategy that's been developed, and that strategy is metastasized, right? Mm-hmm. And that it's outside of the kind of inception of the kind of strategy that's put in place, and is now just playing lots of different donors, lots of different interests. And you're seeing it with all kinds of like alt-right groups that are being funded by similar think tanks that, and different publications all over the right. So, the question of the centrality of Koch I think is important, but it's a metastasized issue that I think is really tricky to address.
Okay, I want to make a quick announcement. There are a couple of people who have questions who are raising their hands. That's not how we're doing this because it's technologically could become sort of difficult to moderate raising hands among 30 people. So if you could please put your questions in the chat, I swear I will read them with as much passion as I possibly can. Okay. Lee, I'm keeping your question to the end, by the way, because I think it's a good one to end up on. This one is, I think, half a joke, maybe not. What do you think William F. Buckley would think about his organization being co-opted? Is he rolling in his grave, or?
Personally, I think it depends upon if you believe the kind of the aura of William F. Buckley, right? I think that there's this idea that he is the kind of genteel conservative who kept out the racists and the anti-Semites and preserved conservatism from his kind of more barbarian side. I think that is largely fictional, and that the facilitation of, basically what we show in the book is that the plutocratic libertarians and the racist neo-segregationists after Brown v. Board and the John Birchers, that's hand in glove, right? And I think that Ann Nelson's amazing new book, Shadow Network, and her look at the Council for National Policy only shows this all the more. The plutocratic libertarians are happy to be in bed with the Southern Baptists, are happy to be in bed with the Christian nationalists, happy to be in bed with the Republican political operatives. And I think that, any idea that William F. Buckley is above all of this, I think is just kind of it would be believing what he would want you to believe, which I think is not true. I think it's structural racism and white supremacy through and through.
Okay, sort of a tactical question, and then I want to make sure to leave time for sort of what do we do? What is the path forward? But a tactical question, which is more damaging? Allowing people to spread misinformation and lies on campuses, or stopping them and opening the door for free speech violation claims? Which one is easier to address and correct? And actually that might get us into the next set of questions, which are basically, what can we do about this in the future? And what are your ideas on that? So.
Do you want that one, Ralph, or?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think that's essentially the key question here, and it's one that is, the campus free speech crisis is really just largely an attempt to monopolize one side of that question. That everyone should err on the side of protecting free speech, no matter what the cost, whether misinformation, whether ideology that you might consider awful or whatever, and so I think the question, and for people who've worked or gone to school on campuses, especially who've been politically active, it's a question that's sort of brought that's addressed through conflict, through struggle, through contradiction, and through like active political processes. And so it's something that student activists are organically coming up against, something the faculty are organically coming up against. And for decades within the academy, basically it has been allowed to function by its own means. And the principles of academic freedom have essentially are a living thing that evolved to the times. And so what's important, and I guess what we've been trying to point out in the book, is that the ability of universities to navigate these questions on a daily basis is what's important to protect, not to necessarily have a catch-all answer, which is what this campus free speech political machine is doing. It's trying to say, no, we have to pass all of these policies that err on the side of free speech. They must be uniformized with, state top-down control, as opposed to bottom-up organic evolution of these policies and these questions.
An example that we use in the book is Charles Murray at Middlebury, right? I think that in the book, we explicitly say we're not dealing with the question of whether students should have protested Charles Murray at Middlebury. Like, that's not our goal, is to get into that question. I think that reasonable people can disagree on that point, right? But what we're saying is the story that gets told all throughout the media is Charles Murray went to Middlebury and was protested, and that's bad. That's the silencing of speech, right? But what we demonstrate is that actually there's this whole history of racist actions on Middlebury campus that students were fed up with. They were gaining no traction in their organizing over years, trying to get the school to change. And then Charles Murray is coming to campus. And if you look at their protest, they're protesting the school more than Charles Murray. Charles Murray becomes a vehicle to make a claim about the school. And then that gets interpreted as just simply being shut down and protesting Charles Murray. And if you look at the fact that it's a student group that's paid by the American Enterprise Institute to bring Charles Murray to campus, then it becomes just a more interesting and complicated question of who's allowed on campus. And the AAUP standards is very clear that these are questions, these are hard ethical questions that have been part of the academy as long as there has been an academy, and they need to be dealt with thoughtfully and complexly and ethically. And when you have groups like FIRE saying, you must do this or we will sue you, then you just can't have those really important academic questions about the relationship between free speech and academic freedom on campus.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you talk a little bit about Ralph's Corporate Genome Project? And did it contribute to this book, Ralph?
Yes, yeah, it did. So a project that I've been working on these past few years called the Corporate Genome Project is essentially an attempt to take this political network and give it a treatment, essentially trying to understand, the whole of it. And so the challenge for anyone who's up against this political network, which is increasingly everyone on Earth, is that it's too complex to understand right off the bat. Like your average student or administrator, as I mentioned, isn't going to see the campus free speech crisis for what it is because it's too complex. And so what I've been working on is essentially a large database that can capture all of the moving pieces, aspects, and actions of this large political network, and essentially create a machine that can pull back the veil, this incredibly complex veil that is being sort of pulled over everyone's face. And so what, in particular for the book, we examine a lot of different organizations and we trace them. Let's see, sorry, I'm doing this. So this is the site, corporategenomeproject.org. I haven't gone public with the application yet, but that's right around the corner. And so essentially we were able to, we have a lot of money, we have a lot of totals, dollar figures reported throughout the book in terms of what organizations are supported by which donors. And the Corporate Genome Project, we were able to compute those totals and kind of track these organizations and trace, basically did the following the money for us. And that is essentially the approach that we were advocating more generally. And so, so we use the database in order to keep up with all the totals throughout the book. And then in the future, we'll hopefully be using it for more. But then, I don't know, Isaac, maybe this is a good time for you to talk about your project as well.
Yeah, so I also do a project called Faculty First Responders, which is as a result of a colleague of mine being attacked by campus reform. There's a Black sociologist who was accused of calling for the death of white people that led to just a terrible situation on campus where, he was harassed and there was calls of violence to our campus and the administration responded to it really badly. So what I've done is since January of 2020, I started following campus reform every day. Kind of the claim is that if my argument is right, that campus reform feeds stories into the right-wing media ecosystem, then you can kind of predict what's going to be the next big story by following campus reform. So we follow campus reform. I have an RA who bless his heart, reads the stories of campus reform. And when they accuse a faculty member of liberal bias, we reach out to that faculty member and say, here's a resources about what campus reform is. They're not a news organization. They're a right-wing attack organization, an activist and partisan organization. And then we also provide links to the website that provide tools and information about how faculty can respond, and also how administrators can respond so they don't give into the campus reform narrative. And right off the bat are kind of telling, being aware to follow the money and to kind of know what campus reform is and respond accordingly. So that's the project that I do now. It's led to a number of stories about campus reform and a survey of people who've been attacked by campus reform that we did in conjunction with the American Association of University Professors. And yeah, that's that project.
And then on the Corporate Genome Project or either of them, or any of the research that you've done, is there a list of professors who are funded by the Koch brothers or by the Koch network?
So the Corporate Genome Project, one of the collections of profiles that the database generates is for universities. And so, what I've gone for at least the top 100 funded universities and many of the lesser funded universities, essentially have done our best to identify what are the programs at that university that are funded by the Koch Foundation or the similar donors, and essentially, what does that program constitute? Who is involved in it, and so on. And so it definitely will include the names of faculty who are involved in it. And then in addition, if you're looking at a particular university, the database also retrieves any connections that those professors have to Koch network think tanks and political organizations. And so you can basically look at a given university, see what are the corporate funded programs on campus, and then see what are the connections to the rest of the Koch network off campus. And so that's one part of it for sure.
Wow. So there are a lot of questions about, has 60 Minutes done a story on this? Would you guys go on to the Majority Report and the David Feldman Show to discuss your book? In other words, what are your plans for getting the word out there? And how can people help?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're sending it to all the journalists that we have contacts with. It's going to be written up in a number of places. The Progressive magazine is going to run an early excerpt of the piece. We're doing some interviews at various places, but I mean, we'll talk about this stuff whenever and wherever. I think that there's little that I love doing more than talking about the Koch donor network with Ralph Wilson. So I would do whatever venue, wherever.
Okay, we have about, I'm told I need to turn on the light. We have about 7 more minutes. And I know that I have a little announcement to make at the end, but what do you think is, beyond exposing this, what's in our toolkit to do about it? I mean, should we be demonstrating? Should we be, we should be, I'm sure, asking universities to look at their donor influence policies. Are there other specific things that you all can recommend?
Do you want to take it, Ralph, or?
Sure, yeah, sure. It's so tricky, and one of the reasons why I absolutely loathe this topic personally of free speech is because it's such a contrived political strategy. It accounts for the fact, and so cynical. It accounts for the fact that they're going to trigger protests, and in fact, that becomes the objective. That the more of a ruckus that they cause, the better. It's a trap in so many different ways. When a controversial speaker is announced that it's coming to campus, they're banking on counter protests, but there's also a moral imperative to oppose these deplorable ideas, and so it's very tricky. This particular thing, I think one of the most important things, and I guess one of the few examples of leaked information coming out of the secretive summits that the Koch network puts on, is their efforts, their effort to capture what they call the middle third. And the middle third is, their concept is that they already have essentially a third of the population that's going to vote their way. And there's another third of the population on the other side of the political spectrum that they have no chance with. And so they feel like the next generation of political winning is based on their ability to capture that middle third of the population that's left, that could be swayed either way. And I think this free speech issue, when looked at in a way that's unanalyzed, or in this limited fashion that people are exposed to it, this has been a very effective way of polarizing people in the middle third, not necessarily against, for example, civil rights, but against the tactics of protesters and progressives. And so even though it's kind of a soft strategy, educating people in that middle third about the trick that's being played on them is kind of a key for future political change, because it essentially has created a division within the left of people who, are essentially very much attached to this ideal of free speech, but they don't understand the malicious intent behind this current incarnation of and how it's being used in politics. So it's a trap for a lot of different reasons. And so protesting it is hard to do. It's, but essentially, if something like this happens on your campus, one of the most effective ways that isn't just, for example, protesting a speaker, is educating people about where's the money behind this speaker, and neutralizing their effect. Essentially, one of the few things that we can hope to do with this kind of information is inoculate each other and the people who need to be who need to stay on the right side of history, and not be sort of detoured by this political trick. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the few things we can do.
And I think
sorry. Go ahead. No, please.
I mean, I think that it's really important to understand the degree to which this strategy works, precisely because it's secret, right? So critical race theory became an issue for exactly the same way that campus free speech becomes an issue, right? There's a think tank hack who's part of a think tank, who has direct connection to the right-wing media ecosystem, manufactures a controversy and spins it out. And we could very well lose the governorship in Virginia because of critical race theory and this completely manufactured nonsense, right? And I think that the ability to kind of counteract that in real time, to say, wait a minute, everybody's talking about critical race theory right now. Who's funding that, right? Everybody's saying stop the steal right now, just like that. Everybody's saying stop the steal. Where is that money coming from? And whenever you see a new controversy that seems to appear from out of the blue, the instinct and the toolbox has to be towards where's the money. Because if we had caught Chris Rufo the day of, when he's laying out critical race theory as something that we should all be scared about, then it wouldn't have the same kind of grasp that it has now. And so to kind of in real time respond by following the money and making that the story, I think is really key, and to make it public, because these networks work when people don't understand that they're connected.
Isaac, I think a question that did not come up, and we're coming up on our allotted hour. I don't think anybody's going to just shut us off here, but if people need to go, obviously they need to go. Guy Keenan had a question, and I added to his question. He asked if money, free speech, according to Citizens United, ruling, then billionaires have the biggest megaphones. Are there any prominent progressive legal shops working full-time against right-wing legal groups? My addition to that question, which is germane to what you were just saying, is there anything of this kind of coordinated effort on the left to influence policy through universities, through these tempest in the teeth, manufacturing these narratives? Do we see anything on this scale that exists on the left? I know there are conspiracy theories, but what about the reality?
Yeah, maybe I can take that one real quick. So there's almost in response to the large Koch network, there became I think what's called maybe the Democracy Alliance, and that is not at all on the scale of what the Koch network is doing, but it's similar. Essentially, it's a place where progressive donors are trying to sort of strategize and pull their money together. It's nowhere near the size or near as effective as what we see the Koch network doing. There have been some attempts, to try to make model progressive policy, but nothing that's really taken a hold at all on the scale of, or even in the neighborhood of the Koch network. It's just, I think, harder in the first place to get these kinds of efforts moving because political progressives, on the state and national levels just really don't have the leverage or the money to contend. So even if they had a copy of the infrastructure, and we're using the same strategy, they still face a tougher challenge, especially because the Koch network and these donors have been doing this for decades. They've got a solid 50-year head start. And so it's a steep climb to make up that distance that's been lost.
And I think that we cannot underestimate that these guys are revolutionaries, right? Like, there was a profound part of Charles Koch's political education was when Murray Rothbard said you have to read Lenin, right? Because Lenin knows how to seize a state. And the state that Charles Koch wants to seize and what he wants to do with that state is not what we want to see, right? It's not what Lenin wanted to see or what any of us here want to see, right? But that's the strategy, right? Is to capture the state. And I think that there's a tendency not to appreciate that level of cynicism and that level of kind of revolutionary desire, right? And so the result is the left gets like, well, we should all, there's a lot of us, lots of, and that's good. That's the strength of a democratic, inclusive, diverse politics. I think that's the kind of society that I want to live in, is not where there's a philosopher king who has this fantasy and then he wants me to live according to his fantasy. But I think that it's important that we don't underestimate the kind of, this is a project of transforming society in the image of Charles Koch. And that there's a lot of money behind it and a lot of desire and a lot of centralization. And so a kind of wishy-washy response, a kind of like a response that's not cynical enough is going to be insufficient, right? It's not going to be sufficient not to be cynical enough about who these people are and what they do. And so I think that being realistic about what is at stake makes it possible to see the weaknesses and to see, when a center or a program stops turning a profit, stops working to his political advantage, the money gets pulled, right? And so increasing transparency, increasing pressure, making a fiasco, making it so the costs of doing this kind of work increase, that's our task, right? Is to be cynical about what they're doing and to make other people cynical about what they're doing in order to increase the costs of their operation.
So I think that's a great note to sort of bring this to a close and to point out a couple of things that Kochs Off Campus is doing these days. One thing that we're doing, one person says, thank you, I love cynics. We are cynical enough in Kochs Off Campus, I think. And one of the things that we're doing is spending time with the Faculty Senate and taking a look at huge discrepancies in how things were authorized and whether or not there was bias in that process and what our donor influence looks like and what the documents show that it really is. And we're also doing sort of the opposite strategy of standing out on the street and doing a protest. There is a Koch Busters Day of Action on Thursday, October 28th. It will be at the corner of Speedway and Campbell from 4:30 to 5:30. If you are fighting climate change, if you are fighting voter suppression, gosh, at this point, after reading about the Kochs' involvement in the tobacco lawsuits, if you are a cancer survivor, for God's sakes, you are fighting the Koch brothers. And so we need you to come join us on the street with signs showing how you are, how your issue associates with the Koch brothers. We will have signs there. You can bring your own signs. We will have free t-shirts. You will have masks, and we will all be together and show ourselves for the force that we really are. So I want to encourage you again, buy the book, ask your library to order it. Can we pre-order it? We can, right? Pre-order the book. I'll speak for myself. I want this book to go far and wide, and I want people to know the name like they know the name of the Bible. I mean, I want it to become a very widely known book. So I think, yes, somebody just put, could somebody put, thank you, how to get the book for 30% off. And where do we go where we use Koch for 30% off?
That's at the Pluto website.
Pluto website.
Right.
Okay, great. Yeah, because somebody asked, wow, are people challenging the book? They must be scared, but of course the book isn't out yet. So let's get the jump on them so that we're ready with our arguments. The title, Andrea, is the same as the title of the talk today, which is Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War. Okay, and with that, I think we should say good evening and thank you so much, Ralph Wilson and Isaac Kamola, for all of your work. Just extraordinary.
Thank you for all the work that you all are doing. It's really remarkable and admirable in every way, and glad to be in this fight with you all.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thanks.